Preemptive American foreign policy has always stimulated a very heated debate, as it's a highly controversial topic. Since World War II and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. foreign policy has taken an active leadership role in international politics. During the 20th century, America focused on illustrating their foreign policy in relation to the Soviet Union, as the two powerful nations regularly competed with each other for social, economic, and political dominance. American foreign policy changed quite dramatically after the horrific attacks in New York City and Washington in 2001. The Bush administration claimed that America is locked in a global war of ideology in which its enemies are bound together by a common ideology and a common hatred of democracy. The U.S. anticipates and counters threats by using all elements of national power to protect and serve the interests of American people. Today, Mundane Politics will cover American interventionist foreign policy.
Good afternoon and welcome to Mundane Politics. With me today I have Rajan Anderson, Wes Thompson, and Garrison McCleary. Today our topic will be American foreign policy. So, do you guys believe that the current preemptive American foreign policy leads to peace or conflict?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I don't believe the American foreign policy to be preemptive per se, because preemptive infers that you're going into somewhere, to some place, to prevent an attack on yourself. But whereas the American foreign policy is more sort of interventionist. They go into smaller countries and they try to enforce their ideals upon them, and in doing so, gain, if their ideals are enforced, and sometimes they just go for a dictator, but other times when they go for their ideals, if those people adopt those ideals, they're more likely to become satellites of America. And I think that is the goal of American foreign policy.
Exactly. I think it's just trying to promote the spread of democracy, really, and that's all they're trying to do. And because they are the perceived leader of the free world, again, they're just creating satellite nations which adhere to America's ideology. And so, again, as Rajan said, I wouldn't consider it preemptive. It's more just, and not even preventative. It's more just spreading democracy. That is their underlying purpose. And so it's like a great deal of Machiavellian realism, and essentially they do whatever they can to just have the end of fostering democracy nationwide.
And via that democracy that they foster, they gain immensely from it, because those democratic societies look to America as the leader of the free world, and will have more friendly relationships with them. And I think in the West, we sort of glorify democracy, whereas in reality, there's probably traditional governments that may be more suited to different country than others. I think it's ridiculous to impose the same sort of democracy that we adhere to in the West in developing nations. Let them develop their own egalitarian political system. Let them deal with their own issues on their own, rather than having this sort of colonialistic idea of pushing our superior values upon developing nations.
I look at it as an ethical point of view, where is this even ethical for the United States to say, when they were colonizing the Philippines, the destruction of the Philippines and the murder of people along the lines, and how these people in some ways haven't progressed any farther. You look at Vietnam, it's still a war-torn country. The Americans still are there. And I think that you look at it and it is completely unethical for someone just to walk in and dictate whether or not you believe it's democracy or not. It's dictation by the American government, to what those people have to adhere to.
I completely agree with Rajan. It's a sense of moral superiority, as though America's morals are so much more revered than the morals of others, and so now the onus is on them to give them the glory of democracy and the glory of American morale. But when that's clearly not the case, it's not their job to do that. It's not within their rights, I believe, to go ahead and do that.
And I think throughout the Cold War, we see this shift because they realize that all these dictators that they put in place in South America, Iran, and other such places, they eventually lead to chaos. So they're trying to promote their own values now, so that satellite nations are essentially created that adopt the values of the West. And I think that it's only slightly different than what was done before. The only thing is that perhaps people have a bit more freedom, but it's not their own freedom, it's Americans' freedom.
And I think it comes down to the point that the American government would only be able to do this if the American people were behind the American government. And the problem is the American government glorifies this as the Americans doing a just thing for society, a just thing for the world, and they're being the humanitarian peacekeepers of the world, right? And the American people stick behind their military 100%. And when you have that, then you have people who are all gung-ho about sending their troops overseas to fight in Afghanistan or fight in Iraq, when it really is up to those people to decide whether or not they want a dictator or they don't want a dictator, or how they're going to do that. We can provide, I think we can provide verbal advice in the sense of how you can democratically and unviolently get to where you want to go. If that country wants a democracy, they have to do it themselves.
And
I would almost say that they justify their preemptivity with this almost a sentiment that if you're not democratic, then you are a threat to the United States, the United States way of life, and that is how they justify preemptive action.
And
though it's more subtle, they'll never overtly say that, but it's clearly the underlying issue. We have a country here that is not democratic, does not foster American values, and so they are a threat to our way of life. And now the impetus is on us to colonize them.
Also, undemocratic states are looked at and, oh, such terrible institutions, when in reality there's been several, especially indigenous governance structures of indigenous groups of people are really quite ideal for small groups of people. And I think we'll be discussing this in another debate, but it's sort of what the Canadian government did to Aboriginal peoples. They put in place sort of westernized democratic societies that really end up leading to corruption and malevolence, because the people, you're basically stripping the traditional governance structures and putting in ones that and saying, oh, these are superior because, I mean, we developed it, so.
I think the Americans are also trying to create a safety net around them. So they're trying to colonize people and make democracy a part of their lives so that the American people can feel free, and they have allies. They have allies in which they can draw resources from. They can draw help from if anything were to happen.
Again, it's all linked to American paranoia. They're doing this for fear of some other nation being able to develop a massive superiority without their morale and without their values.
Yes.
That's what they clearly fear.
After 9/11, U.S. foreign policy changed along with the Bush Doctrine. And then Barack Obama took charge and he instated new goals. And I'm just going to stress these 5 key points. The first being bringing a responsible end to this war in Iraq and refocusing on the critical challenges in a broader region. The second being by building this first truly 21st century military and showing wisdom in how we deploy it. The third being by marshaling a global effort to meet a threat that rises above all others in urgency, just securing, destroying, and stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. The fourth being rebuilding and construct the alliances and partnerships necessary to meet common challenges. And the fifth being, while America can help others build more secure societies, we must never forget that only the citizens of these nations can sustain them. So do you guys believe that Obama's new policy will lead to peace or conflict?
Well, I think that the last point that you mentioned should be the imperative point, that America can only facilitate change. They can't force these nations to change. They can only provide them with the means to be able to change if they should so choose. You cannot impose change. That's an antithesis almost, to force people to have freedom.
Yeah,
that's essentially what they're doing.
What I thought was really ironic is when the Egyptian people went to their
Arab Spring,
revolution, and then the Muslim Brotherhood got in, and all the Americans were like, "Oh, so bad, we need to do something about this." I mean,
they equate Islam with, again, something that is not American. It's foreign, and now it's a threat to America's values.
They want. It's sort of like, even if it's democracy, they don't want it unless it's American democracy,
for sure.
And that's essentially in his foreign policy here it says in a broader region. So I personally I think that may lead to worse things, because I mean it's sort of like saying, okay, we realize that going into specific nations didn't really work, but we're going to try to push them through going through a broader region. And
to be honest, I can understand why America deifies their military and spends so much on their military, because with what they do right now, they foster a great deal of anti-Americanism. And if they did not have the honor that they had, I fear there would be many more terrorist attacks on the United States.
Well, but they created that
Exactly.
anti-American sentiment. Like, I mean, if you look at Al Qaeda, its goal is to remove American influence from the Middle East. So what do? What does America do? They go into the Middle East. That seems completely ridiculous to me.
It is. It's fear mongering on the part of the American government.
American government operates off fear.
It is, and that is the idea of going in and it has to be American democracy. It has to be this. It has to be that. It's all fear mongering by the government. Now, if we talk about how Obama, his new administrative policies are to help facilitate the growth and development of each nation wherever they may be. You watch the Arab Springs. 98% of that was all done by youth over social networking, right? No help by the American people. And they were able to instill democracy into the people of those countries. America didn't have to go into Libya. NATO didn't have to go into Libya.
They did go into Libya.
But they did, that's what I mean. They
Yeah.
didn't have to.
And
And-
I think that sort of, by them intervening, it sort of
It takes
it
the
takes,
whole
it takes away from
It
the
does.
entire process.
it takes
Exactly.
the whole process.
Because now it's no longer the people's victory, it's America's victory.
victory.
And just another accolade that they have to praise themselves and glorify their own nation.
Yeah.
And it killed millions of people.
Yeah.
Throughout American history, millions of people have died in the preservation of American democracy.
I think that America needs to seriously look at its interventionist foreign policy and consider reverting to its pre-World War II more non-interventionist foreign policy. But I think this needs to be done gradually, so they're sort of seen as they don't just retreat into their country all at once and then they have lots of terrorist attacks against them. But if they revert to that, then I mean, unless you're doing it for purely imperialistic means, which invading America, I don't see anyone doing that. There's not really an issue to be had with your government except maybe the people in your own country. So really, foreign terrorists who are anti-American are anti-American because of their influence in
Exactly.
the world. So
If you stop that influence,
yeah.
it's not as big of a
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
So America has been called the world policeman a number of times. Do you guys agree or disagree with this title?
I would call them the world thug. That's a more accurate description because I mean, really, their policing is sort of like, okay, adhere to my rules that may or may not change in the near future without question.
And I don't think America takes into consideration the cultural connotations that are associated with them trying to spread democracy. Again, I think it really boils down to this point of moral superiority and the fact that they think that they've been given this divine right per se to spread their American influence. And again, with it fostering anti-Americanism, I just feel as though they will never cease fostering this anti-Americanism unless they cease their interventionist policies.
And
I like to look at it from a history standpoint. You have Europe and trying to colonize Africa, and they come to the shores of Africa and find a 3 million populated, like a population of 3 million in a concentrated area in a metropolitan city, when Europe was struggling to have that in Europe. And Africa had already had this part of having a monarchy that was structured, that had social works, social systems, social institutions, schools, courthouses, that provided that for the people. But that was not the way that the Europeans had their setup, so they destroyed that, so that
Yeah.
they could have the European style society.
And look where that has led to
Exactly.
let's take, for example, all the colonized people of the world. Indigenous people suffer enormous rights violations everywhere. In Canada and the
Australia.
US, Australia, they're all living in third world conditions. In Africa, we see this massive emergence of a violent culture created by the imperialist European powers. And I think it's just ridiculous to say if we do this in a different way, people will start to love us.
And I think that comes down to the fact that America is like a morally gluttonous society. They love to feel good about themselves, no matter what. They don't take into consideration necessarily the repercussions of what they're doing. So long as they just have this this preconceived notion that well we're doing good, they don't care what else happens. So long as they believe that they're doing good. And so I think this can also be attributed to political apathy. You have a politician tell them what they're doing and say that this will be a good cause for such and such reasons, and they eat it up and they think that America is just this great and prosperous nation, being able to instill their great and prosperous values on other countries without even realizing the repercussions of it.
There needs to be extreme overhaul of the American foreign policy. It needs to be more upon the actions of democratic diplomacy than it needs to be on that. I mean, I think you can do a heck of a lot more damage to a country diplomatically. If you do it diplomatically and you go through other nations to put sanctions on people and to pressure people who are oppressing their peoples to do that, you can do that better as a diplomat than you can.
It's just
as a soldier.
it is simply just assimilation on a larger scale,
Exactly.
and generally, all evidence of assimilation, they've never worked. The people that have been tried, that have attempted to be assimilated, there's so much conflict and strife going on. Again, as you mentioned, the Aboriginal people, that's a prime example. Assimilation was attempted, and they still live in terrible conditions. So just empirical evidence shows that will never foster the positive results that they hope for and they long for.
We are going to come back. So my next question is, American foreign policy concerns peacekeeping and is stating domestic regimes in rogue nations. Do you approve of this, or do you think it does more harm than help?
Well,
Peacekeeping. I don't
yeah,
understand.
I don't understand that.
Peacekeeping. But sorry, go ahead, Robin.
I completely, peacekeeping, I think that's sort of laughable. America defines what a rogue nation
Exactly.
is.
It's all under American connotation of what a rogue nation is, of what an unstable nation is.
Yeah, and lots of these nations, like, they sort of want, like, what their objection to America is them being so involved in foreign politics. Like, if you look at South America and Venezuela, it's Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro and Cuba. They're both sort of against America's companies in the Middle East. Not to say that these places are perfect, but like, I mean, I think it's reasonable to like want independence from America's neocolonialism.
And I think that's in part because political reform it goes beyond the politics and it permeates to the culture. And they will lose a great deal of their culture, I believe, with America always going into these nations and promoting their values. Because culture is related very heavily to values and beliefs.
I wanted to put it like, when you talk, Roger, you talked about, and Wes, about how the state of what a rogue state is in the context of what America thinks that state is. You look at, they prey upon small, weak states. They don't go after China, who has a reputation of horrible humanitarian aspects.
But through economic dependency,
exactly, they cannot do that. So really what it is it has nothing to do with the whole aspect of peacekeeping. It's who the Americans can manipulate in order to gain something.
How they can extend their power.
Exactly. And if they were to say, China, we're not going to have you as a trade partner because you have bad humanitarian issues, China would be like, well, China wouldn't be able to do it anyway. But the aspect is that the Americans' economy would crash.
Yeah, and frankly, it's just sort of ridiculous that they try to do this on smaller nations. I mean, all it does is promote anti-Americanism.
Exactly.
So what do you guys think of Iran and North Korea's nuclear controversies?
Well, what I think about the nuclear proliferation is that it sort of embodies the preservation of old powers. So you have, what is it, before 63 that, I think it's about 63, I could be wrong. Nations before, I think that's wrong actually, but nations before a certain date who acquired nuclear weapons are allowed to keep them, but new nations, emergent powers, aren't allowed to develop them. And nuclear weapons essentially become like a two-tier, and that's why Iran and North Korea and Pakistan and places like these develop them, because if you don't have nuclear weapons, like
Well, let's get back.
it's-
Your opinion
yeah.
isn't taken into
So,
consideration or regard.
Since Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, there's all this talk of preemptive strike by Israel and the United States, when really in developing the nuclear weapons, that's what they're trying to prevent.
I like to look at it when the United States and Russia signed the agreement that every year they would knock off, I think it was something like 5,000 to 10,000 nuclear weapons every year they would take it down. The United States has not kept their promise. Every year since then, Russia has been dropping the nuclear weapons at the same amount that has been decided by both countries in a contract. The United States has not gotten rid of one.
Again, and it also it gives more power to nations that are almost act as proxies for American influence, because you arm them with a nuke, and now you almost essentially validate the American values and morals. It proves that if you adhere to the American dogma, the American doctrine, now you're bestowed with this nuclear power that you're able to ration. Like, for example, they gave India nukes because they were a stable nation that they could trust. But that's only under America's perception of what a stable nation is, which I believe to solely be a nation that promotes Americanism.
I completely agree with you. And what I think about, like, what nukes essentially do is they create these god figures in American foreign, in international politics, and that really shows. It's not just nukes. In the United Nations, if you look at all, it continues there. We have the Security Council, which is made up of these great powers from an era ago, and it's just, and the IMF, it's all about preserving power.
How can you have a nation, a united nation, in which you still bestow a select few nations the power to veto, and essentially just laugh in the process, laugh in the face of the process? You set up these parameters, and you try and create cohesive and conducive collaboration, but that just falls when you have nations that are able to say, we don't agree with you, and so we're going to go on our own and veto whatever you
And
say.
there's nothing you can do to remove us from the Security Council.
You can't.
Now I think there is reason behind certain aspects of understanding certain criteria that will depend whether or not a country gets nuclear weaponry. Like North Korea, if we have North Korea having nuclear weapons, there is a potential risk that could prove to be detrimental to
Do you
the
really,
society.
maybe it would give them more influence in the world, but do you really think that any country in its right mind is going to nuke someone? It's
No,
sort of,
if
it's
someone
sort of
else
like
will nuke
neutral.
someone else,
Yeah.
it would just
It's-
come. we
I don't
continue.
think that. I think that either we sort of need to have a disarmament process, so we don't have these nations aspiring to have more influence
That's
in the
what
world.
should be happening. It should
Yeah.
be disarmament. It's just the idea of when, in the previous debate when you were talking about how having a gun, why other people have guns is because the other person has a gun.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of nuclear.
But it also comes down to who's going to take the first step, who's going to be the first person to be
Exactly.
unarmed and
So the
vulnerable.
United States needs to become the big person
They
and
need to
start
take the
disarming.
I mean, I think I give humans enough credit in terms of their integrity that we've progressed to a point where, we won't have something akin to World War II happening again. We can be disarmed and still get along and collaborate. Maybe that's very idealistic, but I do think we've reached that certain point where just the growing presence of globalization has facilitated a means to just have more diplomacy as opposed to war.
And even if it is idealistic, I think we need to stop saying, oh, well, international politics is the way it is. We're not going to change this. I think we need to actively pursue an idealistic international relations.
We look at it and we have, in a particular time in history, right now is really the most peace we've seen out of human history in I guess modern human history. All of the major countries in the world are at peace with each other, relative peace, I should say. And that's where progress can happen. Major progress can happen if we follow that idealistic outlook. But the problem is that
Those
when we
major
have
powers
exactly the major powers, the United States, Britain, China, they do not want to move forward in international politics.
They're happy to be at truce with each other, but
Exactly.
oppress other nations.
Exactly.
And we have upcoming nations like India, we have Canada, we have all these European nations, we have nations in Africa that are moving up, that are becoming the diplomatic states that we want to see in the United Nations, but those people aren't even given the chance, opportunity
Well,
to
I
get
think
It's about foster. I think it's about again fostering American values, but at the same time, only select few nations will will they essentially give the same rights as themselves. Only selected nations will they say, okay, you are akin to me, we are equals. The other nations, it's a matter of just fostering Americanism. But